Unless you are over 50, you have, in all likelihood, never experienced living in a time of high, persistent inflation. For decades, it seemed that inflation was a chapter that belonged to the past, and that had now been brought under control. How wrong we could be. Although high inflation, which by nature brings a general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing value of money, can hurt most people, it can also be a blessing in disguise for some groups. More on that shortly. Many predicted that we would have sky-high inflation in the aftermath of the financial crisis. The world's central bank set interest rates to rock bottom and let the banknote presses run hot in the form of so-called quantitative easing. Inflation did not occur, even though interest rates remained at record lows for the following decade, with many experts even going so far as to say that there's not necessarily a connection between inflation and money printing. Interest rates were slowly rising when the pandemic hit. Once again, they chose to resort to the same recipe, but this time on an even larger scale. Never before have the central banks pressed harder on the gas pedal, but this time it would turn out to have consequences. Big consequences. With the reopening of society, inflation suddenly began to appear in parts of society, especially linked to raw materials in the first instance. The central banks have received a lot of criticism for having reacted too late to the accelerating inflation, and chose for a long period to call it transitory, a watered-down moniker which, in retrospect, one can safely say that it was not. The central banks have now fallen heavily behind, and have consequently started raising interest rates at a high pace to tame the galloping inflation before it spins completely out of control. As previously mentioned, high inflation is nothing new, but the problem for the Western world is that it's been over 40 years since it was last experienced. This means that very few people alive today have experienced anything other than stable, low inflation. If you belong to the following group, however, it may be that today's high inflation is good news for you. But this presupposes the following. You have a mortgage. A clear prerequisite is that you have debt, preferably in the form of a mortgage. Inflation reduces the value of a unit of money, which consequently reduces the debt owed. A mortgage is usually the largest financial item for most households, and often amounts to 3 to 5 times your annual salary. With high inflation, the proportion of your income that goes towards debt service will decrease each month, making the burden of payment easier to bear. The challenge here, however, is that you can risk having the interest rate on your loan rising, which brings us to the second point. You have a fixed interest rate. If you have a fixed interest rate on your loan, the interest rate will not change, which means that in practice, you have a negative real interest rate. A negative real interest rate means that the interest rate is lower than inflation. Example, your interest rate is 4%, while inflation is 8%. Your real interest rate is negative 4%. There will be large geographical differences here. Did you know, for example, that over 80% of Americans have a fixed interest rate, while less than 10% of Norwegians do? But let's say you have a lot of debt with a fixed interest rate. Are you automatically in a favorable situation? Not necessarily. And that brings us on to the third and final point. That your income also increases. You are unlikely to experience an immediate increase in your income, but historically, wage growth will be linked to inflation. In other words, high inflation results in higher wage growth than you would have if inflation were low. You will therefore be left with a debt that, in practice, is smaller. It costs the same every month, but is a lesser percentage of your salary. That said, it does not mean that now is the time to go big or go home by taking out a giant mortgage and hoping inflation does the work for you. In times of great economic uncertainty, it's wise to be a little extra careful. Even so, some groups, in retrospect, will probably look back on this time as a period when debt went from high to medium, and that is thanks to the high inflation. How is the current inflation affecting your daily life? Let us know in the comment section below, and remember to subscribe to our channel if you want more stories like this.